July 1, 1916. The Somme Valley, northern France. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, British whistles shrieked along a 25-mile front. Over 100,000 soldiers climbed from their trenches and walked into history. Within hours, nearly 20,000 lay dead. But the catastrophe unfolding in no man's land was matched by an invisible crisis behind British lines. As German artillery pounded the rear areas with methodical fury, every telephone cable connecting headquarters to the front was being systematically destroyed. Commanders were going blind. Units were becoming isolated islands in a sea of chaos, and the entire offensive, planned for months, was threatening to collapse not from enemy resistance, but from something far more mundane: the inability to send a simple message. What happened next would prove that wars are not won solely by brave men charging machine guns, but by the unglamorous heroes who ensure those men can actually communicate with the generals ordering them forward. This is the story of how Britain's communication specialists turned the Somme from a disconnected disaster into a coordinated campaign, using dogs, pigeons, and sheer bloody-minded ingenuity to solve a problem that threatened to lose the war. The morning of July 1st had begun with confidence bordering on arrogance. British artillery had bombarded German positions for 7 days straight, firing over 1.5 million shells. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. Surely the infantry would simply walk across and occupy the ruins. The communication plan reflected this optimism. Telephone cables, buried in shallow trenches, connected every battalion headquarters back through brigade, division, and corps levels to the Army command posts miles behind the lines. On paper, it was elegant. General Douglas Haig could theoretically speak directly to a captain in a frontline trench, but paper plans dissolve quickly under shell fire. As the British infantry went over the top, German gunners, very much alive in their deep dugouts, emerged and began their counterfire. Their artillery had one primary mission beyond killing British soldiers: destroy the communication network. German forward observers had spent weeks mapping every British telephone line. They knew where the cables ran, where the relay stations sat, where the signal depots clustered. Now, with systematic precision, they began severing Britain's nervous system. Captain Robert Sutton of the Royal Engineers Signal Service crouched in a communication trench 800 yards behind the front line, watching his world fall apart. The telephone in front of him had gone dead at 7:45, just 15 minutes into the attack. Then another line failed. Then another. By 8:30, he had lost contact with 5 of the 7 battalions under his division's command. He grabbed a field telephone and cranked the handle desperately. Nothing. The line to brigade headquarters was dead too. Sutton turned to his sergeant, a grizzled veteran named William Moss who had been laying cables since 1914. "What do we do?" Moss's answer was immediate: send runners and start digging up the breaks. Within minutes, teams of Royal Engineers were crawling through the communication trenches, following the buried cables, searching for the breaks. What they found was horrifying. The cables were not just cut, they were obliterated. German high-explosive shells had churned entire sections of trench into moonscapes. In some places, 50 yards of cable had simply vanished, vaporized, or buried under tons of earth. Moss's team worked frantically, splicing new sections, burying them deeper, running alternative routes. They would repair a break, test the line, get perhaps 10 minutes of communication, and then watch it die again as another shell landed. It was like trying to hold water in a sieve. By noon on July 1st, The communication crisis had reached the highest levels. At 4th Army headquarters in the village of Querrieu, 12 miles behind the front, General Henry Rawlinson stared at a map covered in colored pins representing his divisions. But the pins were meaningless. He had almost no idea what was actually happening. Were his men advancing? Were they pinned down? Were they dying in heaps in no man's land? The telephone lines that should have told him were silent. Rawlinson turned to his chief signals officer, Colonel John Fowler, and asked the question that would define the next 4 months. How do we fix this? Fowler was a pre-war telegraph engineer who had joined the Army in 1914. He understood immediately that they faced not a temporary problem but a fundamental one. German artillery was not going to stop. The Somme offensive was planned to continue for weeks, possibly months. They could not rely on buried telephone cables. They needed alternatives. That afternoon, Fowler gathered his senior signals officers and laid out the challenge. We need redundancy, multiple systems. If cables fail, we use wireless. If wireless fails, we use visual signals. If visual signals fail, we use runners. And if runners cannot get through, we use anything that can: dogs, pigeons, even carrier rockets if necessary. Some officers looked skeptical. Pigeons. In modern warfare, but Fowler was deadly serious. The French had been using carrier pigeons with considerable success at Verdun. The British had a small pigeon service, but it was barely utilized. That was about to change. Within 48 hours, Fowler had requisitioned every pigeon loft in the British sector. The Army Pigeon Service, previously a backwater staffed by a handful of specialists, suddenly became a priority. Major William Osman, who ran the service, found himself overwhelmed with demands. Every division wanted pigeons. Every brigade wanted pigeons. Even battalion commanders were requesting them. The problem was supply. Britain had perhaps 20,000 trained carrier pigeons in France in early July 1916. Osman needed 100,000. He sent urgent cables to England. Within a week, trains were arriving at the Channel ports loaded with wicker baskets, each containing dozens of birds. Pigeon fanciers across Britain, who had spent years breeding racing pigeons as a hobby, suddenly found their birds conscripted for war service. The logistics were staggering. Pigeons had to be trained to fly to specific lofts. They had to be fed, housed, transported to frontline units, and kept healthy despite the gas, the noise, and the chaos. Osman established mobile lofts, essentially pigeon coops on wheels, that could be moved forward as the front advanced. Each frontline unit received a basket of pigeons, along with tiny aluminum capsules for messages and instructions on how to release the birds. But pigeons had limitations. They could only fly in one direction, home to their loft. They could not carry messages forward, only backward, and they were vulnerable. German soldiers quickly learned to shoot at any bird flying over the trenches. Some pigeons made it through, many did not. So Fowler turned to another animal, dogs. The British Army had used dogs for sentry duty and casualty search, but rarely for message carrying. Now that changed. Fowler contacted the War Dog School at Shoeburyness in England and demanded trainers and dogs immediately. By late July, the first messenger dogs arrived at the Somme. These were not purebred animals. They were mongrels, chosen for intelligence, speed, and loyalty. Airedales were popular, as were collies and mixed breeds. Each dog was trained to run between two handlers, carrying messages in a leather pouch attached to its collar. The training was intensive. A dog had to learn to ignore gunfire, to navigate through barbed wire, to cross shell-torn ground, and to keep running even when wounded. Sergeant Thomas Richardson of the War Dog Training School spent weeks conditioning dogs to the sounds and smells of battle. He would fire rifles near them, set off explosives, expose them to gas masks and smoke. The dogs that panicked were rejected. The ones that kept their focus became messengers. By August, messenger dogs were operating along the Somme front. A typical deployment involved two handlers, one at battalion headquarters, one at a forward company position. The dog would be sent back and forth, carrying messages in both directions. Unlike pigeons, dogs could carry heavier loads and could be sent in any direction. They were also harder to shoot. A dog running low through the trenches, weaving through debris, was a difficult target. The results were remarkable. Dogs proved faster than human runners and more reliable than pigeons in certain conditions. One Airedale named Jack ran through a German artillery barrage to deliver a message calling for medical support, completing a journey that had already killed 2 human runners. Jack arrived at headquarters with a shrapnel wound in his leg, but still carrying the message. He was later awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. But even with dogs and pigeons, the communication problem was not solved. Both animals had limitations. Pigeons could not fly in fog or heavy rain. Dogs could be killed or confused by the chaos of battle. Fowler needed more options. Enter wireless telegraphy. In 1916, wireless technology was primitive. The sets were enormous, fragile, and had limited range. They required large antennas, which made them obvious targets. They were also unreliable, prone to interference, and required skilled operators. But they had one overwhelming advantage. They did not depend on physical cables that could be cut. Fowler ordered every available wireless set brought to the Somme. The standard British trench wireless set, the Mark III, weighed over 80 pounds and required a team of 3 men to operate. It had a range of about 5 miles under good conditions, less in bad weather or rough terrain. But 5 miles was enough to connect a frontline battalion to brigade headquarters. The problem was getting the sets forward. The trenches were narrow, often waterlogged, and under constant fire. Carrying an 80-pound wireless set through such conditions was brutally difficult. Fowler's engineers improvised. They broke the sets down into smaller components that could be carried by individual soldiers. They trained more operators, pulling men from infantry units who had any experience with electricity or telegraphy. They established wireless stations in captured German dugouts, using the enemy's own fortifications as communication hubs. By mid-August, a network of wireless stations was operating along the British front. It was patchy, unreliable, and often drowned out by interference, but it worked. Commanders who had been blind for hours could now receive updates, even if they were fragmentary and delayed. But the true heroes of the Somme communication network were the runners. These were ordinary soldiers, often young men barely out of their teens, who volunteered to carry messages by hand when all else failed. And all else failed frequently. A runner's job was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. Take a written message from point A to point B, but point A might be a battalion headquarters in a captured trench, and point B might be a brigade command post a mile behind the lines. Between them lay a landscape designed by hell, shell holes filled with water and corpses, barbed wire in tangled thickets, machine gun fire sweeping no man's land, artillery barrages that could erupt without warning, poison gas drifting in low clouds, and everywhere the dead and dying. Private Arthur Hubbard, A runner with the 11th Battalion, London Regiment, described his first message run in a letter home. I was handed a folded paper and told to take it to brigade, about a mile back. I climbed out of the trench and started running. Within 50 yards, I was in a shell hole, hiding from machine gun fire. I crawled to the next hole, then the next. It took me an hour to cover that mile. When I arrived, my uniform was torn, I was covered in mud and blood, not all of it mine, and I had lost my helmet. But I still had the message. They read it, wrote a reply, and sent me back. I made 4 runs that day. By the end, I could barely stand. Runners had a life expectancy measured in weeks. Some lasted days. A few, through luck or skill, survived months. They were among the bravest men on the Western Front and the least celebrated. No medals were given for successfully delivering a message, but battles were lost when messages failed to arrive. The communication network that emerged on the Somme by September 1916 was a hybrid monstrosity, cobbled together from desperation and ingenuity. Telephone cables were still used where possible, but now they were buried deeper, often 6 feet down, and multiple redundant lines were laid along the same route. If one was cut, another might survive. Wireless sets were positioned every few miles, providing a backup network. Pigeons were released in flocks, on the theory that if you sent 10 birds, at least a few would get through. Dogs ran in relays, passing messages from handler to handler, and runners, always runners, filled the gaps when everything else failed. The system was chaotic, inefficient, and often frustratingly slow, but it worked. By October, message delivery rates had climbed above 70%, a remarkable achievement given the conditions. Commanders could coordinate artillery barrages with infantry advances. Reserves could be called forward when needed. Medical support could be summoned for wounded units. The British Army was no longer fighting blind. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of the new communication network came during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on September 15th. This was the battle where Britain first used tanks, and coordination was critical. The tanks were slow, vulnerable, and prone to mechanical failure. They needed infantry support, artillery cover, and constant updates on their position. The communication plan for Flers-Courcelette was the most complex yet attempted. Each tank carried a basket of pigeons. Infantry battalions had wireless sets and messenger dogs. Runners were positioned at intervals along the entire route of advance. Observation balloons overhead used visual signals to relay information back to artillery batteries. At 6:20 in the morning, the attack began. Within an hour, the communication network was tested to its limits. German artillery severed multiple telephone lines. Wireless sets failed due to atmospheric interference. But the pigeons flew. The dogs ran. The runners crawled through the mud. And the messages got through. At 8:45, a pigeon arrived at 4th Army headquarters carrying a message from the 41st Division. Flers village taken. Tanks advancing beyond. Request artillery support on coordinates. The message had been written 30 minutes earlier, attached to the pigeon's leg, and released from a trench on the outskirts of Flers. The bird had flown 12 miles through shellfire and machine gun bullets to deliver it. Based on that message, Rawlinson ordered an artillery barrage that helped secure the British hold on Flers. The village remained in British hands. The battle was not a decisive victory, but it was a success, and communication had made the difference. By November 1916, when the Somme offensive finally ground to a halt in the mud and exhaustion, the British Army had transformed its communication systems. The lessons learned were codified into new training manuals. The pigeon service was expanded into a permanent branch. Messenger dog schools were established across the rear areas. Wireless technology was prioritized for development. And runners, those unsung heroes, were finally given formal recognition and training. The statistics told the story. In July, message delivery rates had been below 40%. By November, they exceeded 75%. In July, a message from the front line to Army headquarters might take 4 hours, if it arrived at all. By November, the average was under 90 minutes. The British Army had learned to communicate under the worst conditions imaginable. The cost had been high. Hundreds of runners were killed or wounded. Thousands of pigeons were shot down or lost. Dozens of dogs died in service. Signal Corps engineers suffered casualty rates comparable to frontline infantry. But their sacrifice had enabled the offensive to continue. Without them, the Somme would have been an even greater disaster. The legacy of the Somme communication network extended far beyond 1916. The systems developed there, the hybrid approach of using multiple redundant methods, became standard practice for the rest of the war. By 1918, British communication networks were the most sophisticated of any army in the world. They were a key factor in the successful offensives of that final year, the 100 days that finally broke the German army. But perhaps the most important legacy was the recognition that modern warfare was not just about firepower and courage. It was about logistics, coordination, and communication. An army that could not communicate was an army that could not fight effectively, no matter how brave its soldiers or how powerful its weapons. The men who laid cables under fire, who trained pigeons and dogs, who ran through hell carrying folded pieces of paper, they were as essential to victory as the infantry who stormed the trenches. The Somme taught the British Army that war was a system, and every part of that system mattered. The telephone cable buried 6 feet deep was as important as the artillery shell fired at the enemy. The pigeon flying through the smoke was as valuable as the tank rolling across no man's land. And the runner, gasping for breath in a shell hole, clutching a message in his muddy hand, he was a hero, even if no one ever knew his name. In the end, the Battle of the Somme was a tragedy. Over 400,000 British casualties for minimal territorial gain. But within that tragedy were stories of innovation, adaptation, and human ingenuity. The communication network was one of those stories. It was a reminder that wars are won not just by the men who fight, but by the men who ensure those fighters can work together. The next time you send a text message, think of Private Arthur Hubbard running through the mud with a folded paper. The next time you see a pigeon in a city square, think of the birds that flew through shellfire to save lives. The next time you see a dog, think of Jack the Airedale running with a message and a shrapnel wound. They were the original communication network, and they paid for our modern world with their blood and sacrifice. The Somme was hell, but even in hell, human ingenuity found a way forward.